Hello, hello, everybody. And Asal is going to introduce our sessions because she's always here, as opposed to Mike and I, who are floaters. So,
Yes.
Asal, hello.
Yes, thank you. So welcome to our read-alongs. So for those of you who've been following us, thank you for your support. Hope we've been able to help answer some questions for you. And you know the format of these read-alongs is that we read directly from the chosen standard, and Mike break down the clauses, the requirements. They give you some examples. And if you join us live using the registration link, you can be on the call with us and ask questions and get pretty much free consulting advice for an hour. So without further ado, we're going to dive into our planned section for today from the RIOS standard, the Recycling Industry Operations Standard. And today's topic is health and safety risks. And then we're going to jump to section 4.6 that talks about health and safety controls. So I am going to share my screen as soon as Maya gives me permission. We're learning to Zoom. Zoom, Zoom, Zoom. All right, here we go. So the health and safety risks section can be located in the 3.1 identifying the RIOS footprint section of the RIOS standard. 3.1.3 important health and safety risks states the recycler shall identify the health and safety hazards associated with their operation and the RIOS footprint. In determining important risks, recyclers shall consider activities listed in 3.1 and the nature of the workforce, contractors, and other visitors to the workplace, the nature of the processes, source materials, and past performance of the recycler related to each risk. So we're going to stop.
Okay, but keep the standard up before you go, because this section specifically says the activities listed in 3.1. So in order to see what we need to do here, we need to look up at 3.1 to see what that includes there. So if we go to 3.1 general section, you see in the 3.1b says the RIOS footprint shall include the activities, products, and services of the recycler, including those of outside providers that can be influenced by the recycler, including but not limited to purchasing and acquisition of source materials, on-site processing, operation and activities, transportation, distribution, and delivery, and changes in operational processes, products, or equipments, both negative and positive impacts, actual and potential conditions, routine and non-routine activities, including emergency, relevant stakeholder requirements and views, and legal requirements. So we kind of broke this down in a previous read along. I'm not going to go into so much depth here, but some of the things that's important for the health and safety risk is that in addition to the things that are identified in 3.13, like the nature of the workforce, nature of the process, source materials, and past performance, you also need to consider those things when determining what is your health and safety risk or hazard footprint. So some of those things that come into play here. So let's focus on a little bit from 3.1b. So it includes not only your activities at your facility, but those of outside providers. So that could include trucking companies. What is their impact on them doing work outside of your facility, or when they come to your facility? What are the potential impacts there? And actual and potential conditions. So an actual condition could be something that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, whereas a potential condition could be something like the risk of fire happening, and routine and non-routine activities. So you might have your routine activities doing sorting of the metal and some type of non-routine activities that are done periodically, like annual PM on a machine or going into a confined space or something like that, and including all types of emergencies that could occur in those types of situations. So that's a little bit of 3.1B there. Now let's jump into 3.1A in determining the nature of the workforce, contractors, and other visitors to the workplace. So this is looking at who's on site working, what kind of work, and the nature of the process. So who's working and what kind of work are they doing? It's important to consider that because it depends on what is their level of competency to do the work they're doing and what is the kind of work that they're doing. Some of that, all of that goes into how you need to treat these health and safety hazards and risk. Source material is also very important because depending on what kind of material you have, that could itself present a risk. For instance, if you have titanium at your facility, it's easy for that to catch fire. It could just be exposure to light that causes it to catch fire, or lithium-ion batteries. They're swelling if they're damaged. So you need to consider the type of material that you're handling in your health and safety risk assessment for the RIO standard, because that's very key to look at. And it depends on what your processes are too. What are you doing with the titanium? What are you doing with lithium-ion batteries? Are you solely sorting them, or if you're doing processing? So all of this comes into a risk factor categorization to determine what kind of things you need to consider in your health and safety risk for your RIOS footprint. Also, past performance of the recycler related to each risk. So have you had fires related to titanium or lithium-ion batteries? Have you had accidents related to specific processes that you have at your facility? So all of those things should be considered and a determination made based upon looking at some of those factors.
I think that one of the things that's kind of relevant to this is questions that we could get is, okay, where do I start? What do I do, right? So where you start is you first do the interaction of your processes and list all of the processes and procedures that you're doing. Maybe it can be as simple as listing your departments. And then within those departments, you may even do a JSA or JHA. So to identify health risks related to every single step, meaning process step, meaning the activity, right? And then, or you can simply put together a method where you identify risks for each department or for each process that include the activities, that include outsourced activities, and material that you're handling, like Mike's talking about, but past performance is the best place to first start, because that's going to warm you up. It's like a warm-up exercise because you already know what the risks are. The way for you to take a look at your past performance is really, you might want to talk to HR to see where you had near misses or incidents or accidents, and really to backtrack from there. Then you add all the emergencies, right? Where do you live? Do you live in California or do you live in Florida, right? So are you going to list earthquakes or hurricanes as a potential emergency, right? So those are the kinds of things to kind of warm you up to get started. Once you get warmed up to get started, then the process is going to be easy.
So a lot of people ask me this question, and I'd like your guys' input on it. They ask, how far do we go? Like, where do we stop? Because does it need to do our listing needs to include like just like super unlikely events, such as, I don't know, an alien landing, or you know what I mean? So where do you draw the boundaries to like what the potential risks could be?
I think that's easier with on the environmental side. because the environmental side is limited to impacts on land, air, or water, or use of resources. Whereas on the health and safety side, you kind of have to go through the list of kind of OSHA requirements and potential hazards and risks that could occur for each respective activity. That's why like a JSA or a JHA is a good starting point for identification of the footprint, because you know some type of hazards that are associated with that respective job activity. And those ones are, you know, maybe actual or potential. You know, so I think as long as you kind of stay in those guidelines, you should be good. But it's intended to be thorough, but at the same time, you don't have to have 500 listed.
Yeah.
Unless you're,
Well,
depending on the facility.
Yeah,
Maybe.
your processes and how big your facility is and the activity
Yeah.
that you're doing, of course.
Yeah.
And then, so I have a follow-up question. What about impact on neighboring businesses?
The impact on neighboring businesses is probably more likely in the environmental assessment than the health and safety assessment, but it could be appropriate too if you're using some type of equipment. Yeah, the activities, products, and services of the recycler that could affect, you know, your potential neighbors' health and safety as well. So if it's appropriate, yes, but most of the time that's more applicable to the environmental identification.
And I want to add something with regards to the past performance of the recycler and make a suggestion that you also look at the past performance in the industry in general, because I think that industry performance or industry risks, given this very specific industry with very specific risks and activities that you do, that could also be a helpful jumping point in identifying the risks that the industry that you have by virtue of the fact that you're working in this industry, and also to have the appropriate insurance in place to protect yourself against those risks as well.
Yes, Maya has her hand up, but I want to also say on that note,
I'm presenting. I'm sorry, Maya.
No, it's okay. But I just also want to say to what you said last, that there's also tons of good resources on the ISRI site concerning safety topics, and lots of good information there to see that stuff that's specifically related to the recycling industry.
Cool. That's helpful.
So if I can just say what I wanted to, first question that Asal had was, how far do you go? I wanted to really emphasize that this is going to be fluid based on your current knowledge. Yes, Mike is right. The list is meant to be thorough, but unless you are hit with a pandemic, you're not going to know that is a risk until it's there, right? So now, from now on, every auditor is expecting you to list a pandemic as one of the health risks, right? And then Asal is really like on point about insurances. Take a look at what insurances you have and why you have them. And actually, the insurance is one of the key operational controls that organizations have for themselves internally, right? Should there an emergency happen? And also one of the ways that organizations control their vendors, like trucking organizations or anybody that comes to work on site, they require them to have insurances. The reason that we are required to have general liability insurance or professional liability insurance, because we may have a negative effect on the clients that we're visiting. We may slip and fall, and they want to make sure that we are all able to take accountability for any kind of incidents or accident that happened to us. So I think that Asal had a really good point about insurances. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so diving into section B, or subsection B, recyclers shall identify controls to eliminate or reduce important health and safety risks to an acceptable tolerance. Controls shall be documented as defined in section 4.6 and monitored and evaluated as defined in section 5.1. So while you are speaking on this, I'm going to jump to section 4.6. So
okay, so I'm going to go along with the I like to follow an example through. So we're talking about controls. So we talked about receiving titanium, right? So we know, so recyclers shall identify controls to eliminate or reduce important health and safety risks to an acceptable tolerance. So acceptable tolerance needs to be defined. What is that to you, to your organization? So that should be defined somewhere in your procedure. Does it mean that it's no longer in the important safety, important health and safety risk? I don't know. It depends on your particular operation. But following that through with the example of titanium. So if you receive titanium, you can't fully eliminate the risk, right? But you can reduce it. How can you reduce it? By, if it's going to catch fire, if it has exposure to the sun, don't put it in the sun, right? If you you can't put it out with a regular fire extinguisher, then you need to get the other extinguishers that can put the fire out there. So some of these things are controls to try and mitigate or reduce the risk to an acceptable tolerance. You know, another thing could be a type of control can be training or signage, as we'll see in section 4.6. So all of these things, once you define the health and safety risk, not only important ones, but all of them, you need to determine what are the appropriate controls and how are you using these controls to try and eliminate or reduce your health and safety risk. And that should be something that is fluid over time to actually reduce the risk on an ongoing basis. That is good evidence of continual improvement, which, as you know, this standard is based upon the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. And after you go through each cycle, you're expected to show, you know, some type of continual improvement. So being able to reduce your health and safety risks through whatever types of controls, maybe they're actual like engineering controls, like putting it in a spot that's not exposed to the sun, or administrative controls like training or signage.
So I have kind of like a follow-up, I have a question about that. So in your example, you had a control that was kind of like preemptive. So it's designed to like, to kind of not even, to reduce the risk of something even happening, right? And then you had a control like the proper fire extinguisher, which is kind of like a control that comes into place after the risk has come to fruition, right? So after the accident happened. So first of all, great. You should have preemptive and post-emptive controls in your control system anyway. But how do the after the fact, the post-emptive controls come into place when you're like measuring how much risk something has?
So in this instance, the post-emptive risk is control is having the
I think I made that word up, but anyway.
yeah.
Welcome.
Post-emptive control here is having the fire extinguisher in place, right?
And I would say to measure, yeah, but I would say to measure, that's what it is. It's emergency preparedness.
Yeah.
So for you to measure the control, you're not going to measure it post, right? You're going to measure your control during your emergency preparedness drills. So the key is for you to have the drills, to have the live demonstration on how to use the fire extinguishers for the personnel that are on site, right? And when you are doing, when you have titanium, then when you're having in a fire drill, you want to make sure that your fire department is there during your drill, that you notify your neighbors, like you were talking about earlier, Asal. So when you have an emergency control, then the way that to measure the emergency control is by assessing the success of your drills. And then if it's not successful, then you want to adjust it, right? So that's how I would say but otherwise, you know, your emergency control, once you have an emergency and you have a fire, and you know, if you didn't control it, you didn't control it, right? But that's a little bit too late to measure it. So that's why I would say preparedness drills.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so for point 6A, recycler shall implement health and safety controls in the following order of priority: elimination, substitution, engineering controls, signage/warnings and other administrative controls, and personal protective equipment.
So I want to point out in 4.6 that the first sentence says recycler shall control those operations and activities that are associated with the identified hazards. So that means all hazards. If you go up to 4.5, it says recycler shall control those operations and activities that are associated with the identified important actual or potential environmental impacts. So whereas you have to have a control in place for every environmental impact that is considered important according to your rating or scale or significant, you need to have a control in place for every one of your hazards that are identified. So that's something that is required as part of the RIO system. Even those that are not important, because they still go to health and safety, and they still go to the potential that somebody could be hurt or have some ill health effect over a long-term basis when exposed to that activity or chemical or whatever. So that's a very important thing to know, that you have to have controls in place for everything.
And Mike, I think that this is a great, kind of a highlight. And I think the reason for that is also because this matches perfectly to the OSHA requirements. If you have the activity, you better control it.
Yeah, most definitely.
Hierarchy.
So yes, it says required legally, where the implementation of controls is necessary or required legally to manage the health and safety risk. So so going off of that, in 4.6A, what we have is called the hierarchy of controls. Like, so the most preferred method, the top method, is to try and eliminate the risk or hazard if possible. That's not always possible, as in the situation of dealing with the handling of titanium. You can't eliminate the risk. You can't substitute it here by getting some different kind of material because your clients have the need for that particular type of metal, right? So you can do some engineering controls. Some engineering controls would be to put a shaded area in the yard somewhere to host this material. And then you could put some administrative controls in place, like signage and warning. Titanium, do not use water if catching fire. Titanium, highly combustible. Only trained personnel, whatever the appropriate control is. And other administrative controls are training, having the fire extinguisher, and people who go in that area wearing necessary personal protective equipment. So personal protective equipment is kind of the last resort for when there's no other way to kind of reduce or mitigate the health and safety risk or hazard, and that activity or material still needs to be handled. So that's the last resort, is to try and make sure that people are protected, on their body, whatever part of the body it is that needs to be protected through some form of personal protective equipment.
And I think it's important to note that.
Oh, sorry. The only thing that I would say, like, yeah, sure, personal PPE, personal protective equipment, is a last resort, but it's also a minimum requirement, right? So when you walk into a facility and they're like, oh, we don't have any personal protective equipment requirements, and it is a metal yard, then that raises a red flag. So I think really PPEs is most of the time mixed with all of the other others on the list here.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't think that just because you're implementing one type of control that you shouldn't implement or can't implement another. Definitely there's going to be overlapping controls.
So that's the thing too, is the risk assessment at each stage of the hierarchy. So when you get down to the last one, there's still too much risk for you not to wear PPE aside from required legally. So
absolutely. Health and safety controls shall be established for, sorry, my thing is blocking, all activities, products, and services within the scope of the RIOS management system, including health and safety hazards related to source materials, outsourced products and services, on-site contractor activities, off-site activities, chemicals, and operational equipment.
So I think this is one of the benefits of the RIO standard as opposed to ISO 45001 is that you get instructions in 3.1A or 3.1B, excuse me, and 3.13A, as well as this 4.6B on exactly what you need to identify, what type of things you need to have in place for your controls. And so it gives you a listing of identification and controls that is specific to the recycling industry, whereas you don't get that in ISO 45001 because it's for general use. And this is specific to the recycling industry. So this tells you and gives you kind of a guideline of what to look for. So those source materials like titanium or outsourced products and services like using a trucking company that transports things that might be hazardous materials or hazardous waste. What are the potential risks there? What type of on-site contractor activities like contractors using a man lift or any type of scissor lift or anything like that? What type of off-site activities are you doing? Are you having collection events? How does that impact the health? You know, there's people trying to collect things and there's cars coming in, and all the chemicals that you have, you know, controls need to be established for that. It could be keeping them in a place. It could be keeping them in a cabinet or flammable cabinet or a burned area in case of a spill, or whatever the respective control is, depending on what type of chemical you handle, what type of quantity you have, and you know what is the potential risk of that particular chemical and other operational equipment. So if you're using operational equipment, what kind of checklist or checks are you doing before using that to ensure that it's safe to use? So it kind of gives you a good listing to kind of go through a lot of the things that need necessary controls in the standard here. So this is kind of helpful.
So before we wrap up these sections, are there any final thoughts?
Just the last thing is that, like in 3.13, it does refer to the health and safety controls in 4.6, but it also says that they should be monitored according to 5.1. So it's important to have a ongoing and proactive method to monitoring your health and safety risks. And another important thing was looking at I think it's 3.1, 3.1B talks about changes in operational processes, products, or equipment. So anytime you have a change, is there a change to the process, type of new equipment? You have to have a proactive approach to making sure that those health and safety risks associated with that are identified and put in place prior to that activity occurring, so that you can reduce the potential of risks to human to the workers on site, to human health and safety, I was going to say. So that's a very important thing, that you need to have measuring and monitoring in place for health and safety risk, which is proactive and catching changes and putting proper controls in place prior to them being implemented, so that you can have a system which effectively controls your health and safety risk.
Absolutely. And if you work with Glenview Group, or you are thinking about working with Glenview Group, what Mike mentioned, change management is a big part of what we provide to our clients, as well as assistance in setting up the monitoring activities and whatnot. So with that being said, if you are implementing a RIOS management system and need assistance, Please reach out to Glenview Group at info@glenviewgroup.com. And also, if you would like to sit in on a master class where we go dive into the details of every clause of the standard for R2V3, and it includes the RIOS implementation as well. Please go to our website to register. There's only 15 spots per class, but it includes everything that you need to set up your R2V3 and RIOS management system. And that is going to take place June 7th through 11th virtually online. So you don't even have to leave your house. You can go in your pajamas. And December 13th through 17th in Pasadena, California. And food will be provided. So that's a good reason to leave your house and change out of your pajamas. Thank you for joining us today. Join us next week, same time, same place. And we are going to go over the next section of the RIOS standard. Does anybody know what that is off the top of their head?
Legal requirements.
Yay, legal requirements. See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.